But here, the system of asset management and capital allocation in our country is now so opaque that if people actually knew what was going on, their blood would boil, but they just don't know it. Where BlackRock is a $1 trillion plus investment firm, arguably one of the largest, if not the largest asset managers in the United States, potentially in the world, depending on how you define it. And yet people whose pension fund money, people whose savings are invested in BlackRock's funds are having their own shares, the shares that they own under their name, voted by BlackRock in ways that completely defy their own moral values. BlackRock uses its seat at the investment table to be able to say that the companies it invests in must abide by the standards of its Sustainability Accounting Standards Board on matters ranging from racial justice to diversity to quotas to environmental change or climate change. And I think that they are using their position in the marketplace to flex their muscle, not just in the marketplace of products, which I'm okay with. That's how capitalism works, but also in the marketplace of ideas. And Larry Fink is treating the assets of the other people to whom he is a fiduciary. He owes them the highest possible duty to be able to betray that and instead use it to foist his views onto the companies that he's investing in and concomitantly the society that he's a part of. I think is a real violation of both basic democratic principles, but also a violation of basic fiduciary principles. And to top it off, while preaching about injustice and implicitly waxing eloquent about the so-called ESG or environmental social governance movement here in the United States, doesn't say a peep as he gets a charter to do business in China and actually lobbies on behalf of China in the United States for companies to be able to have differential listing standards in the US if they're Chinese. So I think that is, these kind of actors who act as the man behind the curtain, pulling the strings like this is a puppet master game, they're responsible for this crisis of institutional mistrust permeating the United States because our institutional leaders have given the public very little reason to believe any of what they have to say. They're constantly manipulating the public. If he was pushing anything other than an ESG progressive agenda, I think many people would be coming after him for the kinds of claims he's able to make about superior performance for ESG investing and the kinds of things that he says. And yet, because it is dressed up in the veneer of the modern progressive dogma, and because, by the way, they're quite adept at placing their alumni, as they have, senior alumni into the Biden administration are basically infiltrated by BlackRock and the likes of BlackRock, they end up being celebrated and even getting favorable regulatory treatment instead. And so this is how crony capitalism 2.0 works. Crony capitalism 1.0 was really simple. You have companies that, Goldman Sachs was a master of this game, effectively use some combination of lobbying dollars and placing their alumni in seats of governmental power to win favors in return. Pretty simple. It's crony capitalism 1.0. But crony capitalism 2.0 is actually a lot more complicated. It's actually a bilateral relationship between government and the private sector, where certain members of the private sector are able to capture government and to be able to use that to generate a competitive advantage. But government actors now are using those private companies to be able to do through the back door what they can't do directly through the front door. So they're scratching each other's backs. I lay out numerous cases of this ranging from big tech censorship to the so-called climate pledge that represents features of the Green New Deal that they couldn't pass through Congress that they're now implementing through banks that are refusing to lend to projects that might have otherwise run afoul of the Green New Deal. This is the unique challenge of today, is this new marriage of big government and big business. And worst of all, they blow this new brand of woke smoke to cover it up in the veneer of progressivism so that people can't actually see what's going on. And I personally think that both liberals and conservatives need to wake up to the fact that the biggest threat to liberty and prosperity in this country then is not just big government alone. It might have been in 1980. It is not today. The biggest threat to liberty and prosperity, in my opinion, is this new marriage of big government and big business that is far more powerful than either one alone, because it can do what each cannot on its own. And I think that is far more scary than what Thomas Hobbes envisioned 400 years ago. It is far more frightening than even what our founding fathers envisioned 250 years ago. It is this new woke industrial complex that is a new Leviathan that is, I think, one of the most powerful forces we have seen in modern American history. And I think neither liberals nor conservatives are really willing to do anything about it, because liberals are duped into submission because they love the progressive causes that this new industrial complex is pushing. But conservatives, many of them at least, certainly conventional old school Republicans, look the other way and recite slogans they memorized in 1980 saying that the free market can do no wrong, without recognizing that that free market, when it's commingled with government, does not exist today. And so both sides are actually duped into submission. And so I think the heart of the new conservative movement in particular in this country needs to revolve around the idea that we have to recognize what that new threat is and be able to revise our old dogmas or even come up with new ones that be able to meet that and pinpoint that unique problem today. As I say, we've defended the castle of capitalism from the front door for 40 years without realizing that that castle was invaded through the back door by forces ranging from the woke progressive left to the Communist Party of China. What we need to do is we can't just pretend like we're still in the idyllic 1980s when you defend that castle from the front door and look the other way, but nor can the solution be to just burn the whole thing down, the castle of capitalism down, as I think some newly nascent wings of the populist conservative movement are wanted to do. I think the right answer is to figure out how we sterilize that castle, but without burning the whole thing down. And I don't really see anybody stepping up to do that. And that's a big part of, what I believe, at least I did my best to step up to begin to do in the book through some of the solutions that I offer.
So I want to go back to this idea, and we touched on it at the beginning, you argue basically that having corporations be solely focused on making money, which from a lot of people's perspective is actually the problem, right? You actually argue that this is the counterintuitive solution to the problem, is to getting them back to focusing on that. So anyway, break that down for me.
Sure, yes. So the core case for stakeholder capitalism is, in my opinion, compelling at its core, even though I disagree with it. It's that at the inception of the corporation, there was a grand bargain where society gave corporations these great benefits like limited liability, which say that shareholders are not liable for the acts or even debts of the corporation. That's a great gift that society bestowed on corporate shareholders. And in return, society made an ask to say that implicitly, you have to take societal interest into account when making decisions, not just maximizing profit for your shareholders. Milton Friedman never responded to that claim. Milton Friedman was an advocate of the classical shareholder model, yet he never said anything about those great gifts of limited liability that society bestowed upon corporations. That's what makes the stakeholder capitalist view so compelling by comparison. Well, I finished up the work that Milton Friedman never finished 50 years ago, and that was to provide an answer to that charge. And what I say, through a careful review of corporate law over the last couple of centuries, through a careful review of the American context of corporate law and corporate history in particular, is actually to identify the fact that, you know what? There was a grand bargain at the inception of the American corporation, but it wasn't an implicit one. It wasn't an unspoken one. It was an explicit one. And the explicit grand bargain was that in return for these great gifts of limited liability and other related gifts that would create really powerful corporations, we're going to make an ask in return, but it's not implicit. It is explicit. It is that corporate boards look after maximizing profit for their shareholders, not to protect those shareholders, not just to protect those shareholders, certainly, but to protect the rest of American society from corporate overreach outside the sphere of the market. We said if we were going to create a Frankensteinian monster that was so powerful that it was going to create a monster far more powerful than what any individual outside of the corporation would be able to wield without the corporate gifts, then you better stay in your cage, you better stay in your lane in the sphere of the market rather than roaming free over other institutions that span American democracy. That was the grand bargain. And so to me, when corporations are able to use their cloaks of immunity, their special, what I call class of corporate privileges, to be able to wield power not just in the market, but in the democratic marketplace of ideas, that is actually the greatest abuse of corporate power of all. And that is the one that both liberals and conservatives ought to be equally worried about, because it can turn on both of them on a dime. Today, it happens to be disfavoring conservatives, but that's beside the point. On principle, we ought to be adjudicating our most fundamental questions through free speech and open debate in our democracy.